Time now for Focus. And on day 4 of the latest UN Climate Change Summit, we have a report from Mexico on how global warming is affecting coffee production. Over the last 5 years, it's dropped more than 50% in Mexico. But things are looking up thanks to French agricultural experts. Agnès Valramillon and Anca Ulea report.
It's harvest time in this Mexican coffee plantation. Nestled in the mountainous region of Veracruz at 1,200 meters, these coffee plants grow in the shade of giant ficus trees. With great care and a tune, farmers collect the ripest berries. Inside their flesh lie the coffee beans, the gold of this region.
Once this bean is dried, it will go to roasting. We'll grind it, and that will be the coffee consumers know and love.
On this plot of land, the harvest will be plenty. But coffee production has dropped over 50% in the past 5 years, threatened by climate change. Cecilia Camberos has around 20 hectares of coffee plants. For 2 years, her plantation has been ravaged by a disease called coffee rust. These yellow spots indicate sick plants.
The leaves that are rusted like this one will fall off. And look, this plant is drying out. Its branches are starting to break. All around us here, the plants are completely dry.
Camberos has lost 2/3 of her crop. Coffee rust is well known in Mexico, but the disease has never before reached this altitude. Climate change has brought it to new heights.
It's a lot hotter and more humid here, and that's why these diseases are spreading. Before, they couldn't reach our plantations. We're at a high altitude and it's normally cold here. It's not normal to have this kind of heat.
Scientists confirm in this mountainous Mexican region the summers are hotter and the rains more violent in winter. Coffee plants don't take well to extreme variations in humidity or temperature, but the climate also disturbs another crucial element of its production: bees. Here we see the many beehives of Juan Palais. Bees contribute to coffee's reproduction by pollinating flowers, but their numbers have dropped significantly due to pesticide use and harsh weather conditions.
With the strong rains, the flowers don't have enough nectar because the rain washes it out and the bees have nothing left to eat. They're suffering and they're dying of hunger.
Disease and a decline in the bee population. Mexico, the third global producer of coffee, has been hit hard by climate change. This cooperative deals in Arabica beans. Coffee is blonde before roasting. It's packaged after it dries.
Mexican coffee is destined to be exported, notably to Europe. The Arabica strain is especially good for espresso, but the country has lost 60% of its yields in 5 years. Mexico is now in a race against the climate change clock.
Thousands of hectares lost to rust are now being replaced in Mexico. New, more resistant coffee bushes that hail from across the Atlantic.
The plants on your left are called La Marseillaise. Yes, they come from a French laboratory. These plants are more resistant to rust.
French agricultural engineers based in Provence created this new variety to adapt to a changing climate. These Arabica plants are hybrids, immune to coffee rust.
This plant contains genes from Robusta coffee, which is much more resistant to rust. And it doesn't take away from the quality. It's actually better.
To escape the intense heat, plantations are also moving to higher ground, past 1,400 meters.
That's very high for coffee. Before, we couldn't cultivate at these altitudes, but climate change is wreaking havoc on plantations, so they're moving to places with lower temperatures. We found coffee can live at very high altitudes, and it's adapting well.
After 5 years in crisis, coffee production in Mexico is picking back up. This harvest is the second for these French coffee plants. They have a good yield. The region of Veracruz has lost many small producers, victims of climate change, but the region's prized possession will live on, the black gold called coffee.
For more on this, I'm now joined by Henri Land. He's the head of the Fondation Good Planet in Paris. Hello, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.
So as we just heard there in that report, in Mexico, there's been a 50% drop in coffee production in the space of just 5 years. Are there many such cases, sectors, industries suffering really dramatic consequences of climate change?
Yeah, there are many examples throughout the world. The wine culture in France is definitely having less production because of the change in temperature and the impacts of climate change. Agriculture in general in countries that are very susceptible to dryness and arid spells, such as countries in Africa, are very vulnerable to climate change. And so the economies that are very much centered around primary production, around depending on natural resources, are going to be very vulnerable to climate change, and they are already. There's a World Bank report that came out a couple of years ago called Turn Down the Heat that looked at what a world looks like if we go above 4 degrees of temperature rise by 2100, and it showed how drastically the agricultural production in African countries would drop, for example. So unfortunately, we have to adapt to climate change already, particularly for agricultural production. The truth is there are many solutions to do so, and they're solutions that go hand in hand with also consuming more healthy products, and this is particularly true for agricultural products. And agroecology, which focuses on helping interactions between different cultures and more small-scale agriculture, makes agriculture, for example, much more resistant to climate change. And that's actually what we work on at the Good Planet Foundation with projects that we have in developing countries. But so there are opportunities to fight against this, but we have to take into account absolutely right now.
Now, the latest round of UN talks on climate change are underway right now in Bonn, and I understand that for the next 10 days or so, negotiators are hoping to clarify the rule book of the Paris 2015 deal. What does that mean exactly?
That means that they're trying to work on how do countries kind of harmonize, communicate really clearly exactly what they're going to contribute to the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement sets as a binding target 2 degrees. It says to try even go to 1.5 degrees. That's of general global warming by 2100. However, each country then says what it can do, and it must be very clear about that. And so communicating on this process is something that they need to work out. What should be included in these contributions? How do they communicate? How do they account for all of the different things they do? And so by 2018, next year at COP24 in Poland, they're already going to have to do kind of a dialogue about how they have met the challenge thus far with regards to their contributions. And then in 2023, they're going to have to review these contributions, and they're not going to be allowed to reduce the ambition of each one. So it's a process that is kind of bottom up. Each country says what it must do, and it's also a process that can lead to a naming and shaming in the sense that if a country is not cooperating enough, everybody will know it and will know it very clearly.
Now, the French President Emmanuel Macron has made it clear that this is something that's very important to him, combating climate change. And Paris is going to be hosting a climate conference next month. What can we expect from that?
That's a conference where they're going to try and increase finance for fighting climate change and for moving away from fossil fuels, from helping territories and countries adapt to climate change. It's going to be a conference outside of the negotiations of the United Nations in a way. It's going to be parallel to that. It's going to be serving to try and get lots of different investment and innovative financing techniques to try and fight the climate change problem and get our energy system away from fossil fuels into renewable energy and energy efficiency, into smart cities. Hopefully we also talk a little bit about sustainable agriculture, even though that doesn't seem to be on the agenda as of yet. But it's very important that we talk about climate change in a concrete way. We have negotiations on climate change in Bonn, but ultimately it means that how we consume energy, how we move move around and how we eat, all of that needs to become more sustainable. So if we don't talk about sustainable agriculture and sustainable energy at the same time, we're missing the point of making climate change really concrete in our lives and making sure that it's presented as a social, as a societal, and as an economic issue, which it really is.
Now, just briefly, if you could, because we're running out of time, despite the US attitude, or rather Donald Trump saying that he wants to withdraw the US from the Paris climate deal, overall, are you quite optimistic, though, that the world, other world leaders are taking this issue seriously?
Well, first of all, we have no choice but to be optimistic. The truth is climate change is already having impacts on populations worldwide. So if we're going to say be optimistic or pessimistic, really we've already lost in some ways. Some people are already suffering from it. But it's never too late to try and make things better and to avoid catastrophic conditions. And so, yes, I'm optimistic that the world leaders and business leaders, that associations and NGOs and citizens recognize that climate change is the challenge of our lifetime and that we must go as fast as we can. And even in the United States, we're seeing states like California, we see little cities such as Belmont in the Northeast and such as other cities in even the South and the Southwest where they're going full throttle to fight climate change and to move away from fossil fuels. So the truth is Donald Trump has a very retrograde and absurd position, but he is alone in a lot of ways because very much progress is being made and a pushback against his position is being made in the United States to fight the climate change problem.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to talk to us. Henri Land joining us there, the head of the Fondation Good Planet in Paris.